Welcome to this session on psychedelic music. We're going to look specifically at the music of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, along with some other early psychedelic bands, but our main focus will be on those two. Psychedelia in general obviously gives us a lot of things to think about with respect to basic relationships to society. The idea of psychedelia and this kind of drug use as being a kind of way of absenting oneself from the mainstream and from political culture, from the normal ways of doing things or the normative ways of doing things. That word normative, I think, is worth thinking about a bit, right? The normative are the usually unstated rules. They're the things that are covered by that's not how we do that here. It's not that you're saying, no, we do X, Y, and Z. You just say, no, that's not how we do things here. There's a sort of cultural understanding of how we do things here, right? And that applies to all sorts of things, the specific ways in which we represent gender roles, sexual roles, the way that we represent class, the way that we represent race, and so on. That most of that is normative. It's not natural. It's not the way things have to be. It's the way things have become through various practices, right? And yet they're treated as though they're natural. Right? And the obvious example, I suppose, if we're talking about gender roles, is that during FDR, when he was a child, pink was a masculine color. He was dressed in pink all the time. It wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that pink began to be more and more associated with girls. But the idea of pink being naturally a girl color is something that, I see in people all the time still. This idea that blue is, and then of course now that people are concerned about that kind of thing, people are looking for gender neutral colors or not imposing gendered colors, but pink, the assignment of pink to girls is culturally arbitrary, right? And yet it's treated as though it's normal, and that's why it's normative. Well, the same thing applies to the ways in which we conduct ourselves in society. The idea of dressing a certain way, acting a certain way, being driven toward consumption, being driven toward getting a good job. Those are normative goals and normative values. They're not the only values. They're not the only way of looking at the world. And so psychedelia, even for people who weren't necessarily heavy into the drug part of things, this offered them an alternative set of values and a way of looking at the normative to show that it is not natural, it is merely normative. Let's take a look at some of this. So the psychedelic movements, and I put some people refer to this all as the psychedelic movement. I think of it as a little more fractured than that. Young adults disenchanted with mainstream cultural values that they felt were too focused on being normal or normative, as we were just saying. This is a response to civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam protests. There's a general suspicion of institutions, more than ever before, really, in this country. In the 30s, there was a concern about the gold standard and things like that, and there's always been a certain concern that there's something going on that we don't have full grasp of. But the kind of political and cultural paranoia that we're all familiar with because it's still very much with us today. A lot of that starts in the 60s and is associated to some extent to this movement, but to other movements as well. The counterculture centered in part on drugs, right? That's part of the psychedelic movements here. The very term counterculture is a relatively new term by the time you get to the 60s, right? The idea of a culture that counters the main culture, the mainstream culture, the normative culture. And drugs are seen not just as a form of recreation, but a means to expand the mind, and we'll talk about that more. That has to do, of course, with LSD, lysergic acid diethylmide, developed by Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann in 1943, and that's the picture you see behind the text here. That's Albert Hofmann. It was designed as a cure for migraines and alcoholism, right? It was then of course he experimented with it and saw that it did some things that he wasn't expecting, and he continued to experiment with it. And at first, it's developed in 43, so for a while there, he's really interested in people doing research on it, and he would supply people with free samples if they were associated with a major institution. And so Timothy Leary comes along, and he's I put ex-Harvard prof because he soon will be when he writes the book Psychedelic Experience. But in the 50s, he's a Harvard professor, and he's interested in these the advances of LSD by Albert Hoffman. And so he writes him. He says, "Look, I'm a Harvard professor. I'm interested in doing some experiments." So he's sent some of this material, and what he does is he has these sessions where they all dose, they all take LSD, and they talk about their experiences. The reason he's asked to leave Harvard is because these are not controlled experiments. They're all doing the drugs, including him. So it's not like they're doing it and he's writing down what they say and how they behave from a neutral point of view. There's no control group. They're all doing it and sharing the experiences together. And he tries to make the argument that this is important to the kind of study that he's doing, that it's about participation and so on. But that's not how scientific studies are done for the most part in universities and in scientific endeavors. In 1964, he releases the book The Psychedelic Experience, which advocates the use of drugs as essential to unlocking the doors of perception. And he is inspired in part by Aldous Huxley, who wrote about similar things. And of course, his famous line, Timothy Leary's famous line, is "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." Let's think about that more on the next slide. What does it mean to turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? Turn on, of course, means drugs. Tune in is to tune into this other kind of consciousness, this other kind of awareness. And drop out of the normative values, the normative society. So this isn't exactly, at least it's not a normal or a typical form of political rebellion. It's political, indifference, in essence. It's opting out of the whole game. It's not a politics of resistance. It's not a politics that are trying to change things, reverse the hierarchy. The belief is that whatever thing you do here on the political level is always going to be suspect, because it's always caught up in the kind of consciousness where there's hierarchies, where there's order, where there's a normative set of values, and that the idea of expanding consciousness is to move beyond that. And so it's a kind of dropping out. It's a dropping out of the mainstream and dropping out of the normal way of understanding things. And so Leary connects his LSD trips to the Tibetan Book of Dead and these ancient forms of wisdom. He has a general interest in Eastern philosophy and attaining a higher consciousness. And that phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out, that becomes a kind of catchphrase of the 60s, and we'll see it over and over again. But this idea that drugs will unlock something in you, that we're limited in the way that we see the world, in part because of our own physical limitations, in part because of cultural conditioning, and that we can do better, we can see more, we can be of a higher consciousness, and drugs will assist us in doing that. That what LSD does, one of the things that Leary believes LSD does, is it breaks down the barriers of the ego, the things that keep us separate from everything else, right? This is an idea that goes back at least to Freud, that part of what happens with our connection to the world is when we're in the womb, because we everything feels like it's there to take care of us. We're comforted by the womb. We're nurtured by the womb. That we feel that everything is us in essence, and that slowly what we do through the course of our baby and toddler years is ego formation. And ego is the establishment of the I. Ego is just another word, a Latin word for I. And so what we do is we learn that we are separate from everything else, and that if we want things from the world, we have to make demands on the world, or we have to act on the world. But Leary's suggesting that maybe we go too far in our ego formation, that we really are all connected, and that the world doesn't have to submit to our demands or require us demanding anything of it, that the world has a kind of flow to it, a kind of care built into it, just because everything is connected. And LSD helps us to see that by breaking down those boundaries of the ego. Now, this idea takes various forms, right? Leary is kind of the spiritual guy, the guru type, the more withdrawn intellectual type. But then you have people like Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And then in '64, he begins touring around the country with what he calls the Merry Pranksters. And they're Merry Pranksters because they pull pranks and they do silly things. They stage various events, and they ride around in that very colorful bus that you see up there called Further. It has Further written on the front, right? So where at the front of the bus is where it says you're going. When I used to get the bus from Baltimore to New York all the time, then the front of the bus would say New York, so I knew where I was going, right? Well, this one just says Further. The idea is you're just going further. Going further out, further on, further into a higher form of consciousness, or further into the spirituality, or whatever you want, further into experimentation. It's not all, with Ken Kesey especially, it's not all just love and peace. Right? There's also pushing other people and sort of this act of more a kind of extroverted way of forcing yourself on others and forcing them to be disrupted in their way of seeing things. It's not good enough that you have a higher consciousness. You got to kind of goad other people into it for him. So he starts these acid tests where basically you pay, I forget what it is. It's something very small, like $1. And you get a dose of acid, right? This is a very different kind of liberation from Leary's. It's a more sexually driven, Dionysiac liberation, right? Apollo, the god of order and of light, Dionysus, the god of obscurity and of disorder and of chaos. And what he's trying to do is bring us into that. So for $1, you get a dose of acid, and then you get this light and slideshow and the bizarre sound effects, sometimes rock music, sometimes not. And the idea is to again, break down the borders of the ego, but not because what you're trying to do is attain higher consciousness exactly, but because you're trying to liberate the self and the body. The first one occurred in November of 1965 in Santa Cruz. And then in January of '66, 2,400 people attended one in San Francisco's Fillmore Auditorium. And the Grateful Dead was the house band. And you can hear in my podcast episode, I talk about the Grateful Dead's experiences here. They were allowed to do pretty much whatever they wanted. They didn't have to perform a set exactly. If they felt like playing, they played. If they didn't, they didn't. If they only felt like playing for 5 minutes, that's all they did. If they felt like playing for hours and hours, that's what they did. And that gave them a great deal of freedom to experiment. Here we see a color picture here of the Merry Pranksters, and you can see them in a camp, right? They would just basically tour the country. Sometimes they were in rather revealing clothes, or always in these sort of circus attire. And they were meant to sort of wreak havoc, to cause people to see something they don't normally see, to disrupt their normal day-to-day lives. The bus was often driven by Neal Cassady. Neal Cassady, of course, one of the heroes of the Beat generation. He's the guy that Jack Kerouac writes about in several of his novels, most importantly in On the Road. He's the main character in On the Road. Neal Cassady is thought of as like a poet and an author who never really published. He never really did much. And he, except sort of drive himself nuts with alcohol and drug abuse, but he's this kind of crazy character that the Merry Pranksters venerated. And so he was older than most of them, but he was driving the bus and a part of that group. And he kind of gave it, in a way, a kind of weird Beat generation legitimacy. So now let's go to Virginia City, Nevada with the Red Dog Saloon, which you can see there in a rather picturesque rendition of it. April of 1963, they established a tribal environment at that club, at that nightclub, and had an all-night Native American peyote ceremony. So this is another form of psychedelic drug use. Here they're trying to couple it with something spiritual and authentic. Of course, this is a kind of exoticism in its own right. Their notion of what a peyote ceremony is a stereotypical notion, right? And they're doing it as part of this event around the club. By June of '65, There are several San Francisco musicians, especially the band The Charlatans, that become the house band there. And it's sort of this free-form music and acid tripping. So free-form meaning they're not really playing their songs that they sort of navigate in and out of. And that becomes a big part of the Grateful Dead aesthetic. It's really kind of free-form jamming, having relatively simple chord progressions and going on with it for a while. This is known as the Red Dog experience, because of the Red Dog Saloon. And there's no real division between the performers and the audience. There's no stage. The band's just playing in a corner, sometimes even in the middle, and the dancers are moving around them. And there's this sense of, just like we saw with folk music, there's this sense of a leveling out of the distinction between the audience and the performers. This is also the early use of Bill Ham's primitive light shows. So this idea of projecting light against the walls and having these color slides with the oil in them so that the colors move along the walls in these sort of amoeba-like shapes. Here you have Family Dog Productions. You have Chet Helms and Bill Graham. This is in the fall of 1965. They formed Family Dog Productions, and they organized psychedelic dances at San Francisco ballrooms. They're inspired by Virginia City, Nevada, to bring this to San Francisco. After all, it's still Virginia City, Nevada is kind of an adjunct of San Francisco. The Charlatans were a San Francisco band, so they start with the Fillmore Auditorium, which Bill Graham buys and runs, and so he's the one with the beard is Chet Helms, and the one without the beard is Bill Graham. And they become two of the central figures. Even though neither of them are really musicians, they become two of the central figures within this whole movement, this whole aesthetic, this whole sound. They sometimes work as managers for various groups. They put on a bunch of these shows at first the Fillmore, and then Chet Helms has the Avalon Ballroom, and they become the two central ballrooms in the San Francisco area for the scene. They really foster the scene as a whole. And we'll see some of their poster art. We'll see a lot of what they do in a moment. One of the central moments here, events of the psychedelic scene, it was to some people's mind, the inaugural event was in January of 1967, and this was the Human Be-In, and you can see it was a mass gathering, what was advertised as the gathering of the tribes. Right? It was held in Golden Gate Park, and there's posters, very famous posters for the event. This is the beginning of all that San Francisco poster art that's an integral part of the scene. It was a rendering of poetry, of spirituality, and then music by some of the important early psychedelic bands like Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother, and Silver Messenger Service. It drew a lot of attention, including the media attention, and it led to similar events in New York and LA. They even had a bus company during this time that offered a hippie hop tour, right? It was one of those tour buses where you can get on and off at various places that were showing you the hippies and how they lived. And there were a lot of news shows, little news reports from this time that were going in almost like it's some kind of anthropological study. You know, you can see one from CBS where the announcer says something like, "The hippies are an industrial people," and then they show them at work and at play, and almost like you're looking at some kind of island that's being represented as a primitive culture. So there's this mainstream interest in the hippies. At first, it's a kind of almost exotic subculture, and it really is. It's a subculture, a counterculture, but then it begins to spread at first to New York and LA, and then throughout parts of the country. This is, like I said, is thought to be the inaugural event of the Summer of Love, 1967 and the Summer of Love. It's one of the most important happenings of the era. And the 60s, the late 60s, are a time for these happenings. They're these kind of quasi-theatrical events where, again, the distinction between performer and audience is broken down. John Cage in classical music or concert music ran many of these happenings in California and in New York, where the idea is you'd have a huge space, there'd be all these performances and films and so on that are being shown simultaneously, and it's supposed to be a kind of aesthetics of distraction. You're not necessarily paying attention to any one thing for all that long, you're just moving from one thing to the other, and you're kind of absorbing an overall atmosphere. The name of the be-in ultimately comes from these sit-ins, the protests of the civil rights movements in the 60s, and the teach-ins. The first teach-in was held at the University of Michigan by the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, in March of 1965. That was part of the New Left, right? So obviously, this is sort of connected to these political events, but the idea is not to sit in, not to teach in, not to do anything in, but to be in, right? So it's signifying part of that turn on, tune in, drop out philosophy of Leary's, and indeed he says that at the Human Being. That's where he says the famous phrase. It was inspired in protest to a new California law that was going to ban LSD use, but it didn't go into effect until October of 66, so they had some time, and so they have this big event. The speakers included Timothy Leary, who said the line there, the turn on, tune in, drop out. Ram Dass, an associate of Timothy Leary, is also an professor from Harvard. Allen Ginsberg, the beat poet, who was basically leading a religious service at this event. And then you had Owsley Stanley there, and that's who's in the picture, who provided massive amounts of what he called white lightning, which was a type of LSD, his formula of LSD. The Diggers were also there. They're a community left-wing political action theater group. And they provided free turkeys, and this was kind of their thing. They were feeding people, and then there was some sort of improvisational theater that they would do, those kinds of things. They thought of supplying humanity with food as a kind of theatrical event. So you have two visions emerging of what this scene should be all about. On the one hand, you have promoter Bill Graham, who's organizing shows at the Fillmore, and then you have Chet Helms at the Avalon. Ron and Jay Thelen open a psychedelic shop in Haight-Ashbury district. The San Francisco Oracle and the Berkeley Barb are the area's countercultural newspapers. So you have newspapers that are documenting the scene. And then Rolling Stone magazine starts in November 67, more or less out of this scene. The summer of 67 is known as the Summer of Love. So those two visions, to my mind, are Bill Graham's on the one hand and Chad Helms. And Bill Graham's is the bigger vision. It's the idea that this is going to be a form of mainstream music, a subgenre of rock as a whole, and maybe even take over rock in some ways, which it does. That is big business. It's about big auditoriums and these that it should be moving toward performers up on a stage singing out to dancing and sitting audience members, and so that you're reinstating that separation, that it's kind of glamorizing the scene but taking it to a different more performative level. Whereas Chet Helms wants to maintain that less hierarchical distinction. He decorates the Avalon with long scarves and things that are going to refract the light. The idea is to have the Avalon be in a constant state of installations, and that people are moving around these various environments within that, right? So there's more of a holistic, more of a straightforward hippie vibe with Chet Helms than there is with Bill Graham. But still, both of them are obviously very indebted to the hippie aesthetics that we think of as hippie aesthetics. Here are several of Graham's posters. The one in the middle was designed by Graham, and some of the others are for shows at the Fillmore, not necessarily defined by him, but designed by him. But you can see the sort of borrowing from Art Nouveau, with the curvy lines and the very sort of classic face combined with the psychedelic curvy lines in that first poster. Something similar with the way in which the font works in that middle one. And then the kind of almost Rorschach test kind of symmetry flowing out of the odd use of script in that last poster. You have the light projected through the slides, right? So this is just a slide with some oil and some colored water and ink or whatever. And then as it all blends together and falls apart, it creates all these interesting images. So here's one such image, and on the next slide we'll see another. And these would have been projected against the wall, and so you feel like you're in this sort of strange alien environment as you're dancing and moving around the space. And it creates this kind of it heightens your experience if you're having an LSD trip, I would imagine. But it also just heightens your sensual experience in general. It's this sort of what these kinds of slides do is they disorient you to some extent, because what you're seeing looks like objects, but they're not objects. They're projected against objects, and so they deform your normal understanding of those objects, your normal relationship to those objects. And it is a disorienting experience of space. And what it creates is a kind of womb-like space, to return to our idea about Freud and the lack of ego distinction. It returns you to this womb-like immersive sense of space that you're moving through, not penetrating space, but moving through this kind of ambient space with ambient sound all around you. There are other innovations that are important. For instance, Tom Donahue, the fellow seated in this picture, he develops freeform radio out in the San Francisco area. Longer tracks played back-to-back on KMPW FM. And this is the rise of FM. For the most part, radio up until this moment has been really an AM thing for various reasons. But FM does allow for stereo, and so it allows for more fidelity in that sense. At first, the problem with FM is it's not as strong. The stations projecting FM signals don't seem to be as strong. That changes around this time. And so starting in April of 1967, you have this freeform radio where it's more album-oriented radio. He's not playing, first of all, he's playing tracks back-to-back. It's not a lot about him. It's mostly about the music. He's trying to find innovative ways for connecting one track to the other. And they're not singles. They can be album tracks. They can be just things that he thinks are interesting. So he's curating this kind of almost connoisseur-like experience, right? The idea is that you're not just listening to whatever's popular at the moment. You're hearing the deep contributions of these artists and connecting them in interesting ways. And that kind of freeform radio still exists today. There are DJs in Baltimore that still do it, DJs in New York that still do it. A lot of college stations do this kind of thing. And it's a very interesting and engaging listening experience. It doesn't feel somehow as commercialized. It feels much more authentic for whatever that might mean when it comes to radio listening. Jefferson Airplane, of course, one of the most important groups. Singer Marty Balin and guitarist Paul Kantner formed in 1965, basically to play at Balin's Matrix Club. He had his own club, right, which is pretty useful if you want to have a band, to have your own club, your own place to play, your own place to be the house band. Originally, both of these musicians, Balin and Kantner, had strong ties to the folk music scene, and so they were very influenced by the Weavers and the Kingston Trio, and they were basically a folk rock band, right? And a lot of the psychedelic music has these ties to folk rock. It comes out of the Byrds, and the Byrds had their own little psychedelic moment. And it comes out of that folk rock bit, but builds it into a more obviously psychedelic sound realm. As they rehearsed, they began drawing more on the Beatles and the Byrds and Lovin' Spoonful, and they developed their own sound, that Jefferson Airplane sound. Their first big gig, as far as getting larger attention, it takes place on October 16th of 1965 at the Longshoremen's Hall. I somehow left out the G. They played there. It was there at a hall in San Francisco. October 16th. It's one of the first happenings of the new scene, of the psychedelic scene. And you can see there are a lot of people here. There's the Family Dog Productions is what's presenting it, right? And there's a group, Dr. Strange. There's Airplane. There's the Charlatans and so on. And you can see it says a rock and roll dancing concert, right? Now, what's important about this particular gig is that they get the support of Ralph J. Gleason. Ralph J. Gleason is one of the most important music journalists of this period. He started off really being a jazz critic and journalist, and he's writing for the San Francisco Chronicle, but he's one of the early supporters of this scene. He really sees it as a kind of extension of jazz, of improvisational music, of music that's surprising, that's art-related, that's not as commercial. And he calls them, and this is high praise, this is the guy who really popularized the careers of people like Miles Davis, and Charlie Mingus and so on. And he says that they are one of the best bands ever, referring to Jefferson Airplane. This declaration inspired their deal with RCA Victor. They basically just sent the clip from that article around the various record companies, and it was the most impressive thing in their resume, obviously. So on November 6th, they played at a benefit show for the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and it's here that they met Bill Graham, who became their manager. So this is one of the many groups that he's going to manage. After that, they were heavily featured at the Fillmore West, which is the original Fillmore, Graham's first auditorium. He'll later buy one called the Fillmore East. We'll deal with that later. And then at the Family Dog shows at the Avalon Ballroom, promoted by Chet Helms. So they become a major figure on the scene. Then Grace Slick joins the group. They were the first of the bands from the Bay Area to achieve major success, and they were thought to define the emergent style, especially starting in 1966 when they add Grace Slick, and she brings two of her songs from a previous band with her. And they're two hits. The songs that they're probably the most known for are these two songs: Somebody to Love, which was a pop number 6 in 1967, and then White Rabbit, which was a pop 8 in that same year. Both of these are on their second album, Surrealistic Pillow, of 1967, which was number 3 on the album charts. Notice that the album charted higher than either of the singles. So that goes to show, once again, that what we're dealing with here is an album-oriented art. That psychedelic music tends to be thought of as a large-scale form of art, that the album coheres as a whole, that it's this large statement. It's not about singles, it's not about radio play, although they're getting radio play and they are releasing singles, but the main part of the aesthetic is the album as such. And so this is the classic lineup from October 66 to February 1970. It's Ballin on vocals, Cantor on guitar, Slick on vocals, Jorma Kaukonen, the great guitarist, who also sings some, Jack Cassidy on bass, and Spencer Dryden on drums. Surrealistic Pillow is the defining album of the Summer of Love. The band headlined or strongly featured on numerous festivals. They headlined or were featured on various festivals, including the Human Being in 67, the Monterey Pop Festival, which we'll spend some serious time talking about in a later session, in 67, the first Isle of Wight Festival in 68, Woodstock, which we'll talk about more in 69, and Altamont, which we'll talk about more also in 69. They released several albums after Pillow, but none had the same impact. There's some great songs on some of the later albums, and they get, for a little bit, a little more surrealistic and a little more politically conscious in some of their lyrics. But nothing has quite the impact of Surrealistic Pillow. They then shift members. The classic band ends when Ballin, the founder of the band, leaves in 71, and then Kaukonen and Cassidy leave, and they form Hot Tuna in 1972, and that's the picture you can see up top. In 74, the remaining band members shift to a new, poppier sound, and they become Jefferson Starship, and you can see a picture below of them. Ballin soon returns, but it's a very different kind of group than, we built the city on rock and roll, that kind of thing. It's very different in orientation from what they were when they were Jefferson Airplane. One of the most famous and celebrated bands of the psychedelic scene is, of course, the Grateful Dead. They also have their roots in the folk movement of the early 60s. Jerry Garcia he was a banjo player at first, not a guitarist. And he was in various bluegrass outfits, and that's really how he got his start. By spring of 65, he formed a group that he was calling the Warlocks, that will become the Grateful Dead, out of the remnants of a California jug band. So basically another kind of country bluesy kind of folky band that was called Mother McCree's Uptown Jug Champions. Now they're playing blues covers and originals as the Warlocks. And that's with Ron Pigpen McKernan on organ and harmonica, Bob Weir, who is Jerry Garcia's guitar student. He's singing some songs and playing on guitar. Bill Kreutzmann on drums, and then soon Phil Lesh, who was a classical composer. He was training to be a classical composer. He joins on bass, right, at the request of Jerry Garcia, who wants some element of that in this music, that experimentalism. They quickly changed their name to Grateful Dead, in part because they find out that the Warlocks was the original name of the group now known as the Velvet Underground, and they didn't want that kind of confusion. So the story goes that Jerry Garcia is basically flipping through Webster's dictionary, and he comes across the term Grateful Dead, and they use that term. Right? So these are people that are sort of these spirits that are leading people to good things. That they're the Grateful Dead, right? The first show under that new name was one of the Ken Kesey acid tests on December 4th of 1965 in San Jose. Later that month, they play the Trips Festival. That's another important early gig for them. And soon they have the financial backing of Bear, also known as Owsley Stanley, the Acid King, the guy that supplied LSD to the human being. And he supplied LSD to the acid tests, and he was also a sound engineer, and he rents them a house. He's basically their patron for a while, just outside of Watts, and he provides them with sound equipment that he's designing. He's basically using them to experiment with louder and louder sound equipment, and he builds this monstrous sound system for them, and they're partly famous for that sound system and their later developments of it. The Mantra Rock Dance is another important gig for them. In January 29th of 1967, it's held at the Avalon Ballroom by the Hare Krishna Temple, and it features the Hare Krishna founder, Bhaktivedanta Swami, the poet Allen Ginsberg, and bands like Moby Grape and Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin. So this is another really important gig for them. And they're really known now as a live band, in part because of their experience with the acid tests. So they're creating this aesthetic where they sort of come in and out of songs. They're improvising interstitial moments, interludes between the songs. They're stretching out songs and not always following the same chord progressions to the song. So they'll try to surprise each other by going into different areas and so on. And they get so used to playing with each other that they really learn to follow each other carefully, right? And at this stage in their career, that's a huge part of their aesthetic. That it's all about listening, about being in tune with each other. Sometimes on drugs, sometimes not, but being in tune with what they're each suggesting. So think of it like improvisational theater. They're making certain gestures toward each other, and the other band members can either accept those gestures and go in the direction that's being suggested, or they can refuse them and stay or make a counter offer or whatever. So it's really in the line of improvisational theater in that sense. They signed to MGM in 1966. But they leave the label without ever releasing a recording. They never get one that they're satisfied with. Then they signed with Warner Brothers in March of 67, and they released The Grateful Dead, which has a bunch of short tunes. It's totally unlike their live show, except for the song Viola Lee Blues, which is really the only song from that album that stays in the repertoire in a strong way. Mickey Hart then joins as a second drummer. So now they have two drummers. Mickey Hart is very aware of world music, so he brings a kind of world music percussion aspect to it. Sometimes he's playing the drum set, and both he and Bill Kreutzmann are on drums. And so you get this very thick kind of rhythmic section where, again, they're really having to listen to each other. And for the most part, Bill Kreutzmann is the sort of more solid, groove-oriented drummer. So he's laying down the basic beat, and Mickey Hart's filling in various ornamental ways, but it's not always that way. They sometimes create very complex rhythmic foundations where one's playing in 4/4, the other's playing in a superimposed 6/8, creating all these options for dance and for improvisation and so on. He joins in September of 67. And then they record Anthem of the Sun. And to my mind, this is one of their most successful albums. It's released in July of 68. And what they do is they take segments from their live shows and from their studio recordings, and they assemble it in the studio via multiple tapes in real time with studio improvisation. It's meant to intensify acid trips. That's what they're hoping this album will do. You can see that there's a mandala on the cover here, so they're tapping into that element of spirituality, and each of the members of the band are represented in some way on that mandala. But to me, the most interesting aspect is that mixing of live and studio performances, not always worrying if they're in perfect pitch with each other, in perfect tune with each other. So there's this thick aspect, this unpredictable aspect to the way that they're sequencing the tunes. And for the most part, albums up to this point, even something like Sgt. Pepper's, which it's easy to forget that's only a year before this. even Sgt. Pepper's, which has elements of sequencing where you've planned out how one song goes into the next, it's not sequenced in quite the same way that this album is, where there's really a concern with the whole, the aesthetic whole, and how the songs are really parts of each other in a sense. That the album is kind of a suite of songs, even though you can take various songs out of it. It's influenced in part by Tomorrow Never Knows by the Beatles, and then in part by John Cage and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, especially the latter's tape music compositions, right? Kreutzmann said in an interview later, Phil and Jerry were the ones who figured out we could exploit studio technology to demonstrate how these songs were mirrors of infinity. So there's a wide array of instruments and effects, including prepared piano, kazoos, crotales, harpsichord, timpani, trumpet, and guiro. So there's a wide variety of sounds, but it's really that experimentation in the studio. And this frustrated the company, the record company, because they came up with all sorts of ideas. The story differs depending on who's telling it, but supposedly Phil Lesh, sometimes it was Bob Weir who said it, but the idea was that they would go and record Smog in LA and then go and record the desert air in some other part of the some part of the desert, and then they would mix that to create a rhythmic track. And all this sounded fruity and ridiculous to the record execs, and because they basically kicked out the recording engineer and they wanted to do everything themselves, I mean, that alone sort of frustrated everyone. They frustrated the recording engineers and kicked them out. So the album wound up being incredibly expensive and time consuming, and they're really frustrating the record company in some ways. But they're also frustrating themselves. They don't feel like what they're doing is really a reflection of what they are as a band. Although I think this album does better than they sometimes do live. This to me, this is one of the great albums of this period. They followed that up with Aoxomoaxa, or Oxomoaxa. They say people say it different ways. It's basically a made-up word based on a palindrome, so that you move in to the middle M, and then you have an O on either side, then an X on either side of that, O and A, right? So it's a palindrome, same backwards and forwards. Released in '69. It's even more experimental. It was actually recorded twice, the first time using an 8-track recording technology, but then the studio where they were bought a 16-track recorder, the MM1000, and they're like, well, we have to exploit this thing, right? So they re-recorded the whole album so they could do it on the 16-track recorder. It was really, that recorder was developed by Ampex, which we talked about that company a bit last semester. That was the company that more or less stole the patents from the German companies that had developed magnetic tape during World War II. So the band scrapped the early recording and upped the experimentalism. They made it even more experimental than it would have been originally. The result is chaotic, even muddy in places, but it's surprising and captivating in other spots. It's definitely a worthwhile album. I find it a little more uneven than Anthem of the Sun, but that's personal preference. The band went into serious debt for this album because, again, they're spending hours and hours in the recording studio, and the record company said, well, we're not paying for all that. So they took it out of their advance, and they went into serious debt, and they had to find a way out of that debt. Well, one way out was to release live albums. And so they released Live Dead in 1970, which was recorded at Fillmore West and at Avalon, and it begins to capture the live approach of their music, right? So the Dark Star that's on this, one of the most famous recorded versions of Dark Star, and one that you should listen to very carefully, is 25 minutes all by itself, right? And you can hear how that song is a good example where you can hear that they're sort of noodling, if we're putting it in sort of common terms, on the ending of the previous tune. And then you can hear that Jerry Garcia begins to establish a sort of repeated run, like he's trying to build towards something. And then Phil Lesh kind of captures what he's doing, and they can tell that they're getting ready to go in the Dark Star. But listen to him carefully. You can hear that one of them, I think it's Garcia, but now I can't remember, sort of offers the tune. Right? Early on, he offers the riff. And at first, Phil Lesh, or maybe it's the opposite direction. I think it's actually Phil Lesh that offers it. And Garcia doesn't pick up on it. And then he catches what's going on, and then they play it in unison, and they go into the tune and start the main chord progression. and then you'll hear that there's an extended section in the middle. I mean, the song, The Dark Star, basically has two verses, and then there are these improvisational moments, both before the first verse, after, in between the two verses, and then after the second verse. So the song can be as long as you want it, really. And they experiment with that one in particular quite a bit over the course of their career. Now, this fulfilled their contract with Warner Records, and it recouped some of the losses incurred by Oxymowaxa. And then, along with Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, which are both in 1970, those three albums, all 1970, Live Dead, American Beauty, Working Man's Dead, that really establishes their reputation. Now, in part to get out of their contract with the Grateful Dead, Warner Brothers begins releasing several live albums, just one after the other. They see that this one's successful, so they do release a bunch of others. And this cements the idea that the Dead are most characteristically themselves when performing live rather than in the studio, right? However, I think it's a mistake to think that they're only a live band. And if nothing else, if Phantom of the Sun hadn't already proven that, because, of course, you can't do that stuff live. It depends upon multiple tracks, multiple takes that are being mixed in very interesting ways. Then the next two albums definitely prove that they are also a brilliant studio album band. Let's take a look at those. Their two most celebrated albums, and that's Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, both put out in 1970. And this marks a new direction for them. The band was attempting to capture a bit of the Bakersfield country music sound. So you hear some slide guitar, you hear some obviously Don Rich inspired guitar playing. Then you hear some bluegrass elements like Friend of the Devil, which includes not just bluegrass, but includes the mandolin, David Grisman and so on. An actual bluegrass performer playing with them. The idea was to create what they thought of as a weird country approach to their music, right? Jerry Garcia was very inspired by the Mo Ash recordings that offered a sort of, as one reviewer put it, a weird old America, this other kind of country and folk music that was a little less refined, but still sounded good, but you know, felt a little mysterious, a little weird. And that's what they're trying to create here. There's more focus on songwriting, on creating, you know, most of the songs on these albums are about 3 minutes long. They're single radio-friendly songs. Very well formed, very well put together songs. They're not reliant on extended improvisation, although sometimes when they're playing them live, they'll go for that kind of thing. But on the albums themselves, they're tightly constructed, well-performed songs, right? Especially on the second of the two, on American Beauty, they're very influenced by Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and they're trying to get that beautiful vocal harmony in place of their jazz and psychedelia-inspired improvisation. They're trying to get tighter vocal harmonies, tighter songwriting. The lyrics are mostly by Robert Hunter, who is already considered a member of the band at that point. He was going on tour with them. He's the one that wrote Black Star. He wrote a lot of their big songs. He's writing most of the lyrics for them at this point. And then American Beauty was, of course, like I said, very heavily influenced by the vocal sound of Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And they do it in a very different way, but they do it in a very improvisational way. And one of the things that after Jerry Garcia died and Trey Anastasio from Phish went on tour with them and was supposed to fill that role, he would get frustrated that each time that they did the harmonies from tracks on these songs, they wouldn't do them the same way. They were just sort of seeing where they fit in, and sometimes it clashed and sometimes it worked really well, and that would annoy him because he's a very meticulous kind of musician where he's interested in improvisation, but that kind of thing he wanted in tune and he wanted it to be more or less precise, and they just weren't into that, right? So they're emulating Crosby, Stills, and Nash, but without the same kind of discipline. Although, again, you can, if you take a look at documentaries about the making of these albums, there's one that's, I think, particularly good on Amazon. You'll see that they are working out, at least at that moment for that recording, pretty strict placement of the voices to get all three or sometimes four voices to sound just the way they want them to. So in 73, they established their own label called Grateful Dead Records, and they released Wake of the Flood in October. And this was their biggest commercial success to that point. It's a return to the experimental jazz influence of their earlier recordings. And, you know, they have some other, I think, interesting studio recordings. For me, when we get into the mid-70s, there's various moments of instability with the band. They're adding performers and taking people out. Pigpen dies. They break up for a while, get back together. So there's some great moments later, including even, I like Touch of Grey, their first major hit as far as charts are concerned, as far as the Billboard charts are concerned in the 80s. So they have some great songs after, but they never quite have the iconic status that they have here. And indeed, even when they get back together and they go on the big tours and people start following them again, there's a kind of nostalgia to that. It's kind of a throwback to that 60s aesthetic that people in the 80s and the early 90s were hoping to see again, to recreate, but that was already felt to be kind of lost. The same kind of thing that led to the Lollapalooza Festival and things that we'll talk about when we get to the 90s. That's it for this session. I'll see you at the next.